I'm not the kind of guy who enjoys tearing things down. Matter of fact, I've spent most of my life designing ways to keep things standing, roads from washing out, bridges from settling, neighborhoods from flooding. But one gray morning in early September, I climbed into the cab of a bulldozer and watched 800 feet of brand new steel fencing collapse into the dirt like a row of dominoes. 3 days later, after the first real storm rolled through, 116 brand new homes were sitting in knee-deep water, and somehow people said I was the villain. My name's Daniel Brooks. I'm 56 years old. I've been a civil engineer specializing in stormwater systems for almost 30 years, and I own a cattle ranch just outside a little farming community in western Missouri. My wife used to joke that I trusted contour maps more than I trusted politicians, and after everything that happened, I'd say she wasn't wrong. My ranch isn't fancy. 42 acres, an old white farmhouse my dad built with his own hands, a weathered red barn that's seen better decades, and enough pasture to keep my cattle happy. Every fence post on that land carries a memory. Every oak tree reminds me of somebody who's gone. It isn't just property to me. It's family history written into the ground. For over 30 years, I used the same gravel access road that crossed the edge of my property before connecting to the county highway. Feed trucks used it, veterinarians used it. My daughter learned to drive on it when she was 16. Nobody questioned it because there was never a reason to. Then the developers arrived. At first, I didn't mind. Empty fields next to mine were sold to a company called Cedar Ridge Communities, and within months bulldozers, cranes, and concrete trucks were everywhere. They called the project Silver Creek Estates, promised quiet family living, tree-lined streets, and luxury homes for people escaping the city. Honestly, I figured new neighbors might even help local businesses. I waved to construction workers, dropped off coffee for a few survey crews during winter mornings, even let one of their foremen borrow my air compressor after his quit working. I believed we'd all get along because that's how things usually work out in small towns. Then I met their president, Richard Holloway. He wore spotless boots that had clearly never stepped in mud, drove a black luxury pickup cleaner than most operating rooms, and smiled the kind of smile that somehow never reached his eyes. The first time we spoke, he shook my hand, looked across my pasture, and said, "Beautiful land. Shame it's surrounded by progress." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Construction moved fast. Streets appeared where cornfields used to be, sidewalks replaced fence rows, and every week another house popped up. I stayed busy with ranch work and engineering consulting jobs, so I mostly ignored it. Then one Monday morning I headed toward town to pick up livestock medicine and found a brand new 8-foot chain-link security fence stretching across my access road. Locked gate, fresh concrete footings, bright yellow no trespassing signs hanging every 20 feet. I honestly thought somebody had made a mistake. I drove over to the sales office where Richard was talking with a couple looking at model homes. When he finished, I politely explained that the fence blocked my legal access road. He looked at me for maybe 3 seconds before shrugging. "You'll have to find another way around." I blinked. "Richard, I've been using that road since before your company existed." He smiled again. "Our buyers don't want cattle trailers driving past their front entrance. It hurts the image we're selling. That's not your road to close." Looks closed to me. I wish I could tell you I delivered some perfect comeback. But honestly, I just stood there trying to process how casually another man could decide that 30 years of someone else's life no longer mattered because it didn't fit his marketing brochure. The detour added almost 7 miles every time I needed supplies, fuel, equipment, or veterinary service. 7 miles doesn't sound like much until you're hauling livestock twice a week or paying diesel prices that make your wallet cry every time you fill the tank. My wife, Emily, started noticing I came home quieter than usual. One evening while we sat on the porch watching the cattle drift toward the pond, she asked, "You're thinking about that fence again, aren't you?" I nodded. "It's not the fence." "Then what is it?" "It's the attitude. They honestly believe they can erase people who were here first." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Don't let somebody else's arrogance decide who you become." I promised I wouldn't. I meant it too. About 3 weeks later, another problem showed up. I noticed one of my irrigation lines had lost pressure. After digging around the damaged section, I found fresh excavation marks where contractors had driven heavy equipment straight across the buried pipe while installing fence supports. $8,000 in repairs. Money I never should have had to spend. I called Cedar Ridge. They denied responsibility before I even finished explaining. Richard eventually returned my call. "Prove it," he said. "Construction happens. Things get damaged." Then he hung up. That's when something inside me shifted. Not anger exactly, curiosity. See, engineers develop habits that never really leave us. When something doesn't make sense, we don't yell first. We start looking for the missing piece. One afternoon, I climbed onto the highest hill on my ranch overlooking Silver Creek Estates. I stood there for almost an hour studying the terrain. Something felt wrong. 116 homes, acres of pavement, driveways, rooftops, but I couldn't find a single stormwater retention pond. No detention basin. No overflow channel. Nothing. Every subdivision that size should have obvious drainage infrastructure. Instead, the landscape looked strangely clean. Too clean. That night, I pulled county development records, engineering drawings, and topographic surveys from public files, spread them across my dining room table, grabbed a yellow legal pad and a ruler, and started tracing elevation lines the way I'd done hundreds of times during my career. Around midnight, Emily walked in wearing her robe, looked at the mountain of paperwork covering half the house, smiled knowingly, and simply asked, "You found something, didn't you?" I looked up at her, then back down at one particular drainage line disappearing off the approved plans before quietly saying, "No. But I think somebody worked very hard to make sure nobody else would." Emily didn't ask another question. After 32 years of marriage, she'd learned that when I got that look on my face, the one where I stared at engineering drawings longer than I stared at television, something important was brewing. She simply poured another cup of coffee, kissed the top of my head, and went back to bed. I stayed there until sunrise, comparing approved plans with aerial photographs, county records, grading permits, and elevation surveys. The more I looked, the less sense the subdivision made. According to the documents on file, Silver Creek Estates was supposed to include 2 retention ponds capable of handling a 100-year storm event. Those ponds simply didn't exist. Instead, every storm drain, every curb inlet, every underground collection pipe pointed toward the lowest edge of the subdivision, which happened to be my pasture. Around noon, I walked that section of my property carrying a survey rod and an old GPS receiver I'd used for years. At first, everything looked normal. Thick grass, a shallow drainage swale that had always carried natural runoff after heavy rain. But then I noticed patches of fresh soil where nothing should have been disturbed. I pushed a steel probe into the ground. Clang. Metal. I dug a little farther until the end of a large plastic culvert appeared beneath the grass. It wasn't old. The joints were clean, the material almost new. I followed the line for another 100 yards and found another outlet hidden behind brush. Then another. Whoever built them hadn't wanted anyone to notice. They'd buried the entire drainage network just inside my property line where most people would never think to look. I stood there in complete silence. It wasn't just unauthorized work. They had quietly turned nearly 15 acres of my ranch into the subdivision's drainage basin without asking, without paying, without recording an easement, and without obtaining county approval. Every major rainstorm was being diverted onto my land. Suddenly, the wet spots that had appeared over the past year made perfect sense. They weren't natural anymore. My ranch had become part of someone else's engineering plan. The next morning, I drove to the county engineering office. Linda Foster had worked there almost as long as I'd worked in private consulting, and when she saw the rolled-up drawings under my arm, she laughed. "Daniel, you only come in here when somebody's about to have a really bad day." "Depends who signed these permits," I answered. We spent nearly 3 hours reviewing everything together. She frowned more with every page. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and whispered, "These drainage revisions were never submitted." "Meaning?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Meaning whatever was installed out there isn't what the county approved." She called the chief inspector. By late afternoon, 3 inspectors were walking my pasture with cameras, measuring wheels, and notebooks. They uncovered pipe after pipe after pipe. One of them actually stopped, looked toward the subdivision, and muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." The official report arrived 4 days later. Unauthorized drainage infrastructure. Unrecorded discharge onto private property. Failure to construct required stormwater retention facilities. Potential violation of both county code and state environmental regulations. Reading that report felt strangely satisfying, not because I wanted anyone in trouble, but because for weeks I'd been treated like some stubborn old rancher complaining about progress. Now the facts were doing the talking. My attorney, Sarah Mitchell, drafted a certified demand letter. It was straightforward. Remove the fence blocking my historic access. Eliminate every piece of drainage infrastructure crossing onto my property. Restore the damaged irrigation line. Repair my land. 30 days. That's all we asked. Do you think he'll listen? Sarah asked before mailing it. I looked out her office window toward the courthouse lawn. No, I said. People like Richard confuse patience with weakness. Sure enough, day after day passed without a response. Day 10. Nothing. Day 20. Nothing. Day 29. Still nothing. On the 30th day, my phone finally rang. Richard, you actually think a couple of county inspectors scare me? He asked, laughing. Richard, I replied calmly. This isn't about fear. It's about fixing something that never should have been built. You aren't touching that fence. We'll see. He chuckled again. You don't have the guts. Then he hung up. I sat there for a long minute staring at the phone before smiling to myself. He still didn't understand. This had never been about guts. It was about property lines. The following morning, just after sunrise, 3 pickup trucks rolled into my driveway. The first belonged to the licensed demolition contractor. The second carried a professional survey crew. The third belonged to Sarah and another attorney from her office. Every corner marker had been verified. Every boundary flag had been checked twice. We weren't guessing where my land ended. We knew. The bulldozer operator, a quiet fellow named Pete, climbed down from his machine and asked one question. Everything we're removing is on your side. I handed him the survey map. Every inch. He nodded. That's all I needed to know. Word traveled faster than I expected. By the time Pete lowered the blade against the first section of chain-link fence, a dozen homeowners had gathered inside the subdivision watching from the sidewalk. Some filmed with their phones. Others looked confused. A woman carrying a toddler walked over to Sarah and asked, "Why is he tearing down our fence?" Sarah answered politely, "Because this portion is illegally blocking access across his property." The woman frowned. "Nobody told us that." "I believe you," Sarah replied. Richard arrived 20 minutes later in a cloud of dust, jumped from his truck, and stormed across the construction site. "Stop," he shouted. Pete lifted the blade and looked at me instead of him. Richard pointed a finger inches from my face. "I'm calling the sheriff." I shrugged. "Already talked to them yesterday. They're aware of today's work." His expression changed for the first time. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived a little later anyway. They reviewed the survey, the county notices, the legal paperwork, and after a brief conversation, one deputy turned to Richard. "Sir, everything being removed is located on Mr. Brooks' property. This appears to be a civil matter." Richard's jaw tightened. "You can't just stand there." The deputy answered with a calm voice I've always respected in good law enforcement. "Actually, that's exactly what we're going to do." Pete eased the bulldozer forward again. Steel posts snapped free of the concrete one after another. 8-foot fence panels folded onto the ground with a loud metallic crash that echoed across the neighborhood. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. It wasn't that kind of moment. It felt more like watching an illusion disappear. Once the fence was gone, excavation began. Backhoes uncovered the hidden drainage pipes one section at a time. Every pipe that crossed onto my land was carefully removed. Every unauthorized culvert disappeared into dump trailers. Finally, the shallow ditches that had been carved across my pasture were filled, graded, and reseeded. By sunset, my property looked more like it had before Cedar Ridge ever arrived. Richard stood near his truck for almost the entire day without saying another word. As we packed up, he looked at me and quietly said, "You'll regret this." I looked back at the subdivision stretching across the hill, neat rows of expensive homes glowing in the evening light, and answered, "No, I think someone will. I just don't think it'll be me." 3 days later, dark clouds gathered over western Missouri. The Weather Service issued a heavy rainfall warning, predicting nearly 2 inches in only a few hours. Emily stood beside me on the porch as thunder rolled across the valley. She slipped her hand into mine and asked softly, "Do you know what's going to happen?" I watched the first sheets of rain sweep across the rooftops of Silver Creek Estates before answering in almost a whisper. "I know what's supposed to happen, because for the first time since they built that neighborhood, the water has nowhere left to cheat." The rain started out gentle, almost peaceful, the kind that usually settles the dust and makes the field smell alive again. Then the clouds opened up. Within an hour, the gutters along Silver Creek Estates were running full. Another 30 minutes, and every storm drain was swallowing water as fast as it could, until it couldn't anymore. Emily and I stood on the porch without saying much. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't hoping anyone's home would flood. I was simply watching physics do exactly what physics has always done. Water follows the path available to it. And for years, the only reason that subdivision stayed dry was because my ranch had been carrying a burden it was never designed to carry. This time, my pasture stayed almost exactly the way it was supposed to. The natural drainage swale handled the rain just fine, but the water coming from the subdivision had nowhere to illegally escape. Around lunchtime, my phone started buzzing. First one message, then another, then a dozen. Photos, videos, streets disappearing beneath muddy water. Garage doors with brown water pushing underneath them. Basement windows completely submerged. Somebody had filmed kids splashing through what looked like a shallow pond where the neighborhood park had been just the day before. By evening, local news trucks were parked outside the entrance. The next morning, the county declared parts of the subdivision unsafe until emergency inspections could be completed. I drove past once, mostly because the highway into town ran that direction anyway. Homeowners were dragging soaked furniture onto their driveways. Wet drywall was piled along the curb. You could hear generators humming from half a block away. A middle-aged man I'd never met waved me down. I rolled my window down, expecting an argument. Instead, he asked, "You're the rancher next door, aren't you?" I nodded. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Nobody ever told us the drainage system crossed your property." "I figured they didn't," I answered. He looked back at the flooded street before quietly saying, "If we'd known, we would have asked different questions before buying." That conversation stayed with me longer than anything Richard ever said. Those families weren't my enemies. Most of them had trusted the wrong people. A week later, the county released its findings. Silver Creek Estates had never received approval for the drainage system that had actually been installed. The required retention ponds had been eliminated during construction. Millions of gallons of stormwater had instead been redirected onto neighboring private property mine. Cedar Ridge Communities was ordered to design and construct a completely new stormwater management system before the development could receive final compliance. Estimated cost, just over $3 million. Then the lawsuits began. Homeowners sued the developer. Insurance companies sued the developer. Mortgage lenders demanded answers. Subcontractors claimed they had followed management's instructions. Everybody suddenly remembered emails they couldn't find and meetings they couldn't quite recall. Meanwhile, Sarah filed my lawsuit. We weren't asking for revenge. We documented every dollar I'd spent because of their decisions. Fuel from the endless detours. Lost work hours. Irrigation repairs. Land restoration. Engineering evaluations. Excavation costs. Legal fees. Damage to pasture. Environmental cleanup. Everything was supported with receipts, photographs, expert reports, and county records. Richard's attorneys requested mediation before the case ever reached trial. During that meeting, he looked tired for the first time since I'd met him. His expensive suit couldn't hide the dark circles under his eyes. He slid a settlement proposal across the table without making eye contact. Sarah reviewed it, looked at me, and gave a slight nod. It covered nearly everything we demanded. I signed. Richard signed. Neither of us smiled. As we stood to leave, he finally spoke. "You could have handled this differently." I looked at him for a second before answering. "Richard," I asked. "I called. I documented. I sent notices. I gave you 30 days. The only thing I didn't do was surrender." He didn't have a response. 6 months later, Cedar Ridge Communities filed for bankruptcy protection. Construction crews spent almost a full year tearing up roads, installing oversized storm pipes, building 2 massive retention ponds that should have existed from the very beginning, and rebuilding sections of landscaping throughout the neighborhood. The new entrance included something else too, a wide access gate connected to my original ranch road, exactly where it had always belonged. Funny how expensive common sense becomes after people ignore it long enough. Every now and then I still see families from Silver Creek Estates when I'm in town. Some wave. A few have stopped to apologize even though they personally never did anything wrong. One couple told me they almost blamed me until they read the county investigation themselves. "We thought you caused the flooding," the husband admitted. I smiled and said, "No, I just stopped preventing it." There's a difference. Looking back now, I don't think this story is really about a fence or a bulldozer or even a flood. It's about what happens when people convince themselves that ownership only matters if someone richer agrees with it. It's about the danger of believing money can replace integrity, or that paperwork doesn't matter because nobody will ever look closely enough. I've spent my entire career telling clients that water always finds the truth hidden beneath the surface. Turns out people aren't much different. You can cover mistakes with grass, asphalt, landscaping, and expensive marketing campaigns. But eventually reality shows up, and when it does, it usually sends the bill to the person who ignored the warning signs. I still wake up every morning, drink my coffee on that same old porch, listen to the cattle moving across the pasture, and drive through the same gate my family has used for decades. Nothing about my life feels richer than it did before all this happened, just quieter. And honestly, after everything, quiet feels like a pretty good reward. Now I'd like to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have removed the fence and the illegal drainage after giving every legal warning possible, or would you have kept trying to negotiate even longer? Was Richard simply protecting his business, or did he cross a line the moment he decided someone else's property rights didn't matter? Share your thoughts in the comments because I read every one of them. And stories like this always seem to spark some of the most interesting conversations about fairness, responsibility, and where justice really begins.